as a parent myself, I'm extremely humbled for how challenging it can be in the moments where everything comes together. But one can imagine those who are less advantaged and living in really dire conditions, having even less of those bandwidths, or in cultures where talking to kids is seen as something that you shouldn't do because you're wasting your time or because they wouldn't understand what you're saying. I was born in a relatively small village of southern Colombia. It's landlocked, so there's not a lot of fun things to do in the ocean or anything like that. We do have a river, a number of friends, and a lot of creativity and not much to do. So we had to develop our own future thinking and our own skills there. That pursuit, in combination with my parents, who one is a doctor and the other one is a farmer, and so one brings the science and the let's say very hard disciplines. The other one brings the simplicity and love for the land.
Welcome to Seedstars podcast. Seedstars is an organization that aims to have an impact in emerging markets by supporting the local entrepreneurs, investing in their ventures, but also sharing their story globally because we really believe they are the true heroes. We'll be listening to them and other thought leaders and disruptors that are really shaping the future of tomorrow. And we hope that together we can build a sustainable impact.
Welcome to Seedstars podcast. Today we are receiving, I want to say, a dear friend because we've been collaborating since a couple of years now together in a different projects. And this friend is Fabio. So I'm allowing myself to call you a friend, and we'll discuss a bit later on how you've been supporting Seedstars as well. But please introduce yourself, and then we'll go into more questions to better understand your journey, Fabio.
Excellent, thank you. And yes, of course, I do consider not only you but the community of Seedstars as an extended family to the Jacobs Foundation. And personally, I enjoy so much working with you guys. So very welcome. My name is Fabio Segura. I am the co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation. In sum, what we do is to invest in education, in the future of education, if you will. We like to understand from an evidence perspective what works in action that we can take to effecting change at the systems level. We'll talk a bit more about that later.
For sure. So the Jacobs Foundation focuses on education only, right?
We do child and youth development. Our current strategy and our development is to go much more into learning, into embracing the differences and the similarities, so what we call technically the variability and heterogeneity in learning. But broadly speaking, we work from ECD to primary to vocational training in some child and youth development. Is our next step to go really into learning and education and seeing how we can actually contribute to improving it in different contexts.
So for people listening, ECD is early childhood development, right?
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And so early childhood development, what does it mean exactly? So where does it start? Is it from 0 to 8 or something like this? Is that correct?
There are different measures of it. 0 to 7 is the space we work on. The most critical years are the first 1,000 days. It's the time of your life where your brain is wiring itself, when you're actually creating the infrastructure, the architecture that would allow you to develop in life. So this is why it's so critical. And there are a number of things that should be done in this critical period, from stimulation to nutrition to caretaking, in a way that you can be better prepared and having the best chance in life. So this is what we've done here in Switzerland for the last 12 years, and something that we continue to do in many programs across the world. But it's a critical period that requires some investment and some thought into it, and some partnerships to be really strong in order to make the most of this period.
That's very interesting. What do you call the best chance in life? What kind of chances are we talking about? Are we talking about, I don't know, becoming a very good student or having a very successful career? What does it mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the success definition is something that everybody can define for him or herself. But I think having the possibility to pursue what you value in life. And by that, we mean having the ability to pursue education, if you will, to learn, to determine your own future, to help others, to be healthy, to respond to challenges, to take opportunities in your hands, to be creative, to contribute to society. And all of that has a combination of different elements. On one hand, you have to be prepared to enter whatever system you choose to get into. For example, if you go into the formal school system. At the time of entering, you should be nourished, you should be supported by your family, and so on. During that period, also at school, you should be having access to key inputs like infrastructure, like critical thinking, teachers that are there, that are prepared, school system that is managed to results in a way. And so having a chance in life means to really make the most of your potential, wherever you are and whoever you are around the world.
And we're actually, it's a topic that is extremely interesting for us. And we actually have a program now in Abu Dhabi with an organization called ECA, and it is exactly on early childhood development. And something that came out from that, so basically we are supporting startups in that sector. And something that came out is that it's not only when the children are born, it even starts earlier. Because,
Exactly,
for example, if you have malnutrition, that can have an impact on possibly the development of the brain of the child. And obviously later on that can have an impact on his capacity to, I don't know, make or participate to certain projects or go to certain schools or something like this.
right.
Is it also something that you've discovered on your side?
Absolutely. Research tells us that it's a time where a few things are critical, especially in mid and low resource environments. One of our partners, the Bernard van Leer Foundation, does a great job on this front. And together with them in the context of Cote d'Ivoire, where we work together also with Seedstars, one of the key messages during the first 6 months of life, one should try to only have exclusive breastfeeding to toddlers. This alone is a message that allows them to gain all of the nutrients, all of the essentials to also fight disease and to get their basics in place in order for brains to wire properly, to develop properly, and to have that early start in life. The other components of that is what parents do, like talking to kids, like singing to them, like playing with them, like staying calm in times of distress. And so those things are not rocket science, but in certain cultures and in certain environments or in certain moments, as a parent myself, one can easily lose sight of them in light of our busy lives, or because the batteries are running too low. And so a reminder of those key messages is quite essential.
Is it something that you also, now that you are seeing all these different research papers and you have all of that kind of information, you have children as well, is it something that you're trying to apply for your own family as well? Or in one way or another, do you behave differently than what you would have before you have read all these facts and figures? Or
if it weren't something we could apply, it would be too theoretical and too out there. I would also say, as a parent myself, I'm extremely humbled for how challenging it can be in the moments where everything comes together. You have had a tough day, the kid is feeling uncomfortable, he or she's crying, you're at the end of your resources. So to sing and to be making eye contact, to stay calm, are things that one exercises and practices. But one can imagine those who are less advantaged and living in really dire conditions, having even less of those bandwidths, or in cultures where talking to kids is seen as something that you shouldn't do because you're wasting your time, or because they wouldn't understand what you're saying. And so to break with those cultural and defaults in those contexts is something that one has to practice and continue to reinforce key messages.
For sure. And so actually we already deep dive into the topic because it's immediately very interesting. And I think that everyone is passionate about that topic for sure. But just now to zoom out a bit again. So with the Jacobs Foundation, one of the activity that you're having is to support that kind of research. Is that correct?
Correct. So from our DNA from 30 years ago, we have been supporting research related to child and youth development in general. So this is one area where we have contributed to seminal works of key scholars on that topic.
And what does it mean exactly, supporting the research? Are you paying some researchers, or I think you're giving some prizes as well, so that their work is being recognized? What kind of other activities are you doing in order to support that research?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, coming from the startup world and from the investment world, I just joined the Jacobs Foundation about 5 years ago, and I joined the world of supporting or funding research. And one thing that one will notice is that the good funders of research do not mandate a study, do not mandate a specific result or tamper with the design. They support a researcher who has already an overlapping interest. A lot of serendipity is built into that process because sometimes they discover things that are counterintuitive or even that are contrary to what your organization stands for. But that is the true value of science, is to acknowledge that as valid and to try and collect as much evidence as possible to make sense of those areas where we don't understand enough the dynamics. So supporting research, in our opinion, in essence, is providing capital to those researchers whose work aligns with understanding better what works, what is valuable in child and youth development, and allowing them to take their research from a scientific perspective and purely from that scientific perspective to the next level. And therefore, trying to understand from that evidence what is applicable in all of that. And some things are very practical and very directly applicable. Some will take many years until we find those applications, but they're not less valuable. They build the foundations for science that we will one day use and be able to build on in practice.
So, like you said, it's been many years now that you've been supporting research. Are there now any projects that is currently applying in the real world, I would say? Or do you have some concrete examples of the results?
Sure, and there are different types of research that we do support. And by the way, we do mandate certain research whenever we feel that there is gaps in evidence that would be applicable or valuable to the work. And I'll give an example of that. We're currently doing some work in Ivory Coast, in Côte d'Ivoire. And one of the areas that we're trying to build a connection between is quality of education, students learning and learning outcomes, and the prevalence of child labor. So if you consider all available literature, everything that is impacted positively by education, like the dependency ratio or poverty, is at the center of the root causes of child labor. However, there is no direct evidence on having children perform better at school, literacy and numeracy, and less prevalence of child labor. So that just doesn't exist in the world. There's very little about it in serious studies. So we're currently organizing, together with some of our research fellows with the World Bank and with a group of companies, a randomized control trial. This is a very large clinical, study that will evaluate with a control group what are the effects of providing parts of the model. On one hand, quality of education in different forms. On the other hand, access to income, and then seeing what happens in terms of results between these two or three different aspects.
And for the more fundamental research that we were mentioning before, like for example, we mentioned the malnutrition effect or all that kind of things. So you were saying basically, and in the end, this can be applied through policies, so government policies, or trying to encourage people to behave differently. And have you seen some effects of these policies? Have them been implemented, especially in emerging markets? Is it something that you've seen, or is it still difficult to push that kind of, or to change the behaviors of people, which are also sometimes cultural?
That's absolutely true. There are various elements to what you're mentioning here. One is individuals' behaviors, and then there's an entire area of research that occupies itself with behavioral theory. So how do we influence or impact behavior from either incentives or from information, or a combination of the two? And there's a lot of examples one can bring up here. We're working, for example, with an organization called Development Media Institute, which focuses on just giving messages to parents about certain public health issues and seeing what the reactions are in terms of the indicators one sees in, for example, vaccination or prenatal consultation and so on. We're using them, we're supporting their methodology to try and understand what is equivalent in terms of quality of education, but also on parenting messages. So that's one of the examples I can bring about here. Another one that is worth mentioning is an organization called MOVA, which comes from Brazil, which basically sends parents text messages about their performance of their children at school and how they're doing, whether the kids showed up at school or not. And they're measuring effects of A, parental involvement in education, and B, performance of kids in terms of learning outcomes. with quite an incredible array of results with a very marginal investment in the intervention, so to say. So those are examples where you can say directly there is behavioral change in terms of the broader public. At Jacobs Foundation, however, the main thing we're looking to do is taking what works in terms of educational models, educational policy, and try to bring those lessons learned to policymakers, therefore impacting the system that embeds the entire public administration of the different systems we would like to see changes on. And so that's a different type of behavioral change, if you will, but it's more policy oriented.
Yeah, and how do you measure your success as a foundation? What do you have some KPIs saying? Okay, we funded all these research, so we funded all these researchers, and now this is the outcome. So how do you measure that?
So there are different, again, ways in which one measures the different forms of research that one is supporting. On one hand, the very pure research, or fundamental research, or basic research, is not something one can measure by its application or by behavioral change. It's one aspect of our funding, which is measured by other criteria, such as how useful has it been to other researchers that are continuing to develop the field, and therefore how many times has it been cited in other researchers' work. That's how research contributes to advancing a field that is moving not by one individual, but by a group of them. And that's one aspect of it. That's just an example. The other type of measures we use for research in terms of the policy adoption are what viable policies. These are policies that are well regulated, that have a budget attached to them, and that have a practical set of programs on the ground happening. So how many of these policies, viable policies, have we informed or improved with evidence from either our programs or that we have translated from different parts of the world where that evidence has been produced? So those are two examples of how we would directly measure the effectiveness of our programs.
And so it's called the Jacobs Foundation. Who's Jacobs?
Well, the family Jacobs is the founder of the foundation was Klaus Jacobs, who is he was an entrepreneur creating different companies that were very successful, number one in their fields. He created Barry Callebaut which became the largest chocolate producer in the world, still is. He created a company called Adecco. Jacobs Sushard, which is not much known to the public, but by their brands like Toblerone and Milka, for example. And so all of these companies were created and were market leaders. Also, a holding, the Jacobs holding, still manages the foundation's assets and grows them on a regular basis, acquiring new assets these days and continuing to dedicate 100% of those dividends to the Jacobs Foundation. The Jacobs family is still behind both the holding and the foundation. Our chairwoman is Lavinia Jacobs, who is our inspiration, our let's say our sails and our rudder in difficult times, and the person who supports us in having a high aspiration in everything we do to maintain the Jacobs high level of aspiration, which is something that characterizes this organization.
I don't know if you could answer that, but like they are initially. Why would they choose education? Because you have many causes and people have different foundations on different topics. They could have chosen environment. They could have chosen, I know, other topics. Why education actually?
Klaus Jacobs believed in the potential of every human being and the right of every human being to reach their aspirations, and that's why our byline is our promise to youth. So we started with that motto. Education is as powerful as a tool to enable you and capacitate you to reach that potential, and that's where we have focused our efforts. It is true that one could have gone for several other endeavors in this mission, but we have remained very true and very loyal to that initial subsegment of human development or child youth development. We have gone through several waves of strategies, which is how to arrive there, how to reach that. And the next one, as I said before, is going to be focused particularly on learning. And so we're going to be digging deep into how do we improve learning, not just in low resource environments like the case we've been mentioning here quite often, Cote d'Ivoire, but also in mid-resource and high-resource contexts. We don't want to be a research organization only. We also don't want to be a programs-only organization. So we're going to continue with using evidence in action that can impact systems. And the last thing we want to do is, we don't want to be an organization from Switzerland telling the developing world what to do. We want to also be active here in Switzerland. In high-resource environments, there's plenty of things one can do to improve education, to prepare better next generations for the future, if you will, and to make learning a new science, and one that is developing into directions that we today still have not exploited.
For me, as you know, we operate only in emerging markets, and we see these huge gaps where on one side you have these autonomous cars, people are going on the moon, and on the other side,
right.
You barely can eat, or you barely can pay with I don't know, with a card or something like this, or like some basic stuff that are just not available. And even if you look at education, people are now doing these crazy algorithms. And on the other side, in Ivory Coast, for example, where we have operations together, we do see like the problem with the education level that is a big issue, and the level of the talents is pretty low in comparison to, of course, the developed countries. And it's difficult to see if and how they are going to work in the future, because now everything is being automated, for example. So a big part of the work that they might currently be doing might be replaced, but they might not have the right talents then with the right skills to adapt. So what's your view on that? How would you how do you handle this kind of stuff?
Well, there are different domains to the question. That's a big question, and quite an interesting one. I think that the first domain you're mentioning is, what is the role of technology in education itself, right? We're seeing also in the investment space that the edtech subsegment or industry has raised billions of dollars in rounds of investment across the board, from the US all down to very low resource countries, like the ones we're present in. Sometimes in rural areas, you will find people with mobile phones using edtech technologies to support education process. And we believe that those processes are just a distribution channel, but they are not good or bad in themselves. What matters is how you use them, and also, again, what proof do you have that the technology itself is helping and supporting learning? And there is very little proof in this space. 99.6% or something like that of the edtech solutions haven't been even tested for effectiveness. And so the self-count of our users are performing on average 20% better than their peers on X domain is usually the result of parents. If your parents buy that technology, it's likely that they also buy books and spend time with you doing homework, and perhaps that is what is making those differences, not the technology itself. So there's not enough rigorous and serious evaluation of whether those technologies are effective or not. That's one part. The second part is, we all remember many large initiatives trying to bring technologies into the classrooms. One large one that comes to my mind from a while ago was one laptop per child. And when JPAL went down to test rigorously the effectiveness of these interventions, they found that in some cases they had negative impact on learning, and it was not because it was because computers are bad or good. It was just because the way in which they were used were creating distractions in classrooms, and because the way technologies should be used is to enable and enhance the interaction between learners and their teachers on one hand. And on the other hand, one thing that technologies can do that is really good for learning is to adapt to the level of the learner rather than to a mass, to a group. And so these technologies can do better than humans. It's just evaluate every user at their capacity and incrementally develop knowledge, what's called adaptive learning. So those are all the pros and cons of technologies in the classroom. And now coming into the world of work that you were mentioning, and where technology is taking us, it is true that we have very basic results in the rural areas of the world, very low resource compared to the urban areas, and also by comparison, in low resource environments, there's much poorer literacy and numeracy levels. And if you go down to the individual level, girls are usually performing, let's say, they're not allowed or given the same opportunities as boys in those environments, so they're performing lower than boys. And so all of this negative preconditions for development will have an impact on the less advantaged. And one thing that we're looking into and seeing is how can we get the basics in place so that these individuals, wherever they are, can develop for themselves the ability to learn, rather than depending on systems that are either too weak or not resourced adequately to reach everyone. And so there again, technologies can play a key role, but we have to be mindful on how to get to those that are less connected, that are farther away from cities, and that are perhaps culturally or locally discriminated against for their condition.
No, it's true, and I agree. Like the connectivity for me is a huge chance for humanity in that sense, because it gives access to all these resources, and we see now so many of these self-made people that just learned everything online. And even a couple of months ago, I went to a big concert of a guy that became extremely famous now in France, and he self-learned everything. So he was in his room and started to program everything, and that's how I did it, and became kind of a very famous singer. And that's true for artists, but that's true for any other jobs, not all, but a few jobs where people can just learn themselves just by watching video stuff and really like learning by doing. I think that's where I'm quite confident about the future, but they do need to have access to that, and that requires of course connectivity, that requires maybe also some support outside on so yeah, that's
and it requires also a mind shift, the mind shift where education is not held by the all-powerful holder of knowledge teacher who is imparting knowledge on a group of students, rather an exploration, a joint or guided exploration. And so therefore teachers and the systems have to also change to seeing that knowledge no longer is something that is concentrated, is distributed, and helping learners navigate throughout that knowledge. And that's one thing. The other one is what you were saying. The skills of the future are about curiosity, are about self-motivation, resilience, ability to collaborate with others and form social capital. Those things are not seen in pensum still today enough. And those are the only things we have legitimacy to teach about a future we cannot predict ourselves at this point in time.
And that's where it comes back to behavioral changes that we were talking about before for me. And for that, I think that role models are key. That's also why we're trying here to portray some heroes that we show that some people are doing things. I mentioned these artists before, and they're role models. Like young people can relate to say, hey, okay, I have access to YouTube. Actually, I can do that as well. I can learn myself. So I think that this concept of role models is from my perspective quite key, to change also the behaviors of this young generation. It's a topic I think that is never ending, but I wanted to also better understand your own journey. How come a young Colombian became the co-CEO of a quite powerful foundation in Zurich, working on that topic of education? So I'd love to better understand the whole journey. You also had some nice award, like you became the outstanding young person of the world I've seen when I think it was 10 years ago or something like this. So yeah, what was the whole journey? So how did it all start? Where were you born? You were born in Colombia, right?
I was born in a relatively small village of southern Colombia. It's landlocked, so there's not a lot of fun things to do in the ocean or anything like that. We do have a river, a number of friends, and a lot of creativity, and not much to do. So we had to develop our own future thinking and our own skills there to try and understand and make sense of the world around us. But apart from all the beauty and the color that this region had, I was also born in a time where the conflict was very evident to everyone living there. Different non-state armed actors conflicting, encountering in this part of the world, made us all question that there would be a better way of dealing with our differences. That there would be another model of society that could be possible for ourselves, and that pursuit, in combination with my parents, who one is a doctor and the other one is a farmer, and so one brings the science and the let's say very hard disciplines. The other one brings the simplicity and love for the land. Those two views put me on a search in very early days of my life, and I started learning about other societies. That's why I started traveling when I was little, learning about languages, something that at the time, before internet and before connectivity and even satellite television, was only possible done through tapes and vinyls that had English courses, right? And then I started working on the very subject of conflict and peace during my studies at university as well. I earned a scholarship to pursue my academic studies in the capital city of Colombia, Bogota, a very prestigious university that trains many of our current political class. And during those times, I was always volunteering for the local peace building agency of my department, trying to find ways in which I could do in practice what I was aspiring to do. After a few years of doing that, it became obvious that the conflict was rooted on something more than just people wanting to fight, and it was about real needs.
But what is, just to understand, why going into that peace topic and conflict? Because is it something that in this small village where you were born and where you were living, you had conflicts in the village itself, or did you have some bad experiences that had an impact on why you would go in that direction, or your family, relatives? Why actually? What was the story behind?
Right. So at that time, and still it's true to a certain extent today, the region of Huila, where Garzón is, I was born in that village, is at the midst of a very intense armed conflict. So where you had guerrillas, you had paramilitaries, you had the armed forces of the government, and some common delinquency. So the direct violence, as one calls it, was very visible in our day-to-day life, and everyone had either a relative or a friend or somebody they know, a neighbor, who had been in one way or another victim to a form of violence in this conflict. And so this is the environment in which we grew up, and we learned to deal with that and grow up with it, and somehow continue to lead normal lives. So that's where that curiosity came. It's like we're great people. We have plenty of resources, and there's got to be another way in which we can deal with those differences in ideology.
And you have brothers and sisters?
I have three sisters.
And are they also engaged in humanitarian activities somehow?
One of them is a lawyer. The other one is an entrepreneur herself, and the other one is a doctor. All of them pursued some form of work within that context. Yeah.
But you were the one going into this peace building or field, and why do you think you more than the others?
I don't know. I think I felt excited about the possibility of something, of finding something that could have an impact, or could make a difference, or the possibility of seeing a different type of reality even. So that's why I started by traveling, right? And when I went into studying government and international relations, finance, government, and international relations at that time, I had the idea that instruments like financial capital, that strategies like social change and impact could be combined. And so impact investing was not a thing back then, but in my choice of the different disciplines that I studied, I was already preparing for that combination of elements. Yeah. That's exciting as well. It was an intellectual challenge.
And you worked for 10 years with the UN, if I'm not mistaken, in this peace building thing. How do you build peace? So that's an interesting concept for me. What kind of activities do you have, and what were you doing in order to build peace?
Right. So I must say that peace is a very complex sort of sum of many things. It's not just the absence of conflict. It's existence of opportunities, is the existence of mechanisms to deal with differences, is the existence of a very proactive infrastructure and groups of people coming together to advance society. And so it's not just that the war or the violence is over. It's quite the opposite. Is very proactive. Peace building refers to looking for ways in which different stakeholders that are themselves in a conflictive situation can find non-violent ways of dealing with them in a sustainable manner. And that requires also that you understand conflict. What are the attitudes of people? What are the behaviors of people? And what are the contradictions or the underlying causes of them? And dealing with each of these three different aspects, what Johan Galtung, father of peace studies, calls the ABC triangle of conflict, is at the essence of peace building. The other part of it is to try and deal with violence in itself, which is only the tip of the iceberg, right? This is when you talk about a ceasefire, you don't talk about a peace process. Those can be complementary, but they're not the same thing. Same as conflict is not the same as war. And so once you've dealt with the violence part of it, you also have to deal with the more rooted causes.
So very naively, but you take on one hand, you take the, I don't know, the FARC, for example, on the other side, you take their opponents, and you try to sit them at the table. Concretely, how does this work? And they try to discuss, or you're in the middle, you talk with one, then you try to negotiate with the other one. And what was your role there?
Right. I mean, one example of this is at one point during the work that I was doing in peace building, we had actually two groups coming together in a at the time it had to be a secret meeting, or it had to be disguised as a civil society meeting, but we all knew they were armed actors, and we sat at the table and said, all right, our high level let's say the cupola leaders are asking us to occupy the territory. So every time we are all in the same territory, there is an armed encounter. How do we deal with that? And how can we, for example, find ways in which the civil society can suffer less from our encountering there? And it was as simple as, in that meeting, this is a very simplified example, as trying to exchange phone numbers. There were cell phones. And seeing via text message and a code that was not even shared with the higher levels of hierarchy, that they had to go in there. So, saying it is, a time where we're mandated to make presence there. Please be aware of that. And so the other groups that were in the area could move out, and there was some sort of an iteration in which they would make sure that they wouldn't have to encounter themselves physically present there. So this is just a very direct example, but there are many more rooted causes of this violence. So in the end of the day, people don't fight because they are fond of war. People fight because they perceive that they don't have the same opportunities or the same rights as others have. And so you have to work at the very essential level in making sure that everyone has at least the same level of opportunities, that the states and that the society can provide the same, let's say, a fair deal to everyone who's a member of it.
Mm-hmm. And it's really cliche, but there are all these TV shows about the narcos, obviously, and they always portrays, and in the news as well, in the media in general, Colombia is always portrayed with these big drug lords. At some point, that must be frustrating for you, because I guess that reinforces that image of Colombia, which obviously is certainly not only about that. It's certainly a very minority of what's happening in Colombia. What's your point of view on that? Because this is a reality. This is true. There are these drug lords and all this violence that you describe, but there's all the rest. So what's your point of view as a Colombian yourself?
There are many perceptions of that. I would say if you ask any Colombian, the first reaction, of course, will be that the country is irritated by this prototype. At the same time, one must acknowledge that the events of the 80s, 90s, and to a much lesser extent the 2010s, 2010s, have been marked by a group of, I would say, even entrepreneurs that were dealing in the industry of drugs and finding very violent ways to position a product internationally and make incredible amounts of money at the cost of social well-being. And so this is part of our history, and it interweaves with the social struggles I was mentioning before, where ideology, the different groups have tried to position an ideology. And sometime in the 90s and early 2000s, they combined. So Guerilla started financing themselves via the production and commercialization of drugs, of narcotics, and so on. And it is true till these days that there is a high production with very high social costs. Now, you were talking about stereotypes and prototypes as well, and role models before. One thing that this kind of shows do is to almost glorify those who partook in this historic period of our country, and glorify them by showing what a great thing it could be to make a lot of money that easy, if you will. And that, I think, has a very cultural effect on large parts of the population, not just the stereotype of a nation, but what do you aspire to do or be when you can actually and very effectively make money quickly? And that, I think, has a much more damaging effect than reputation or stereotypes.
Yeah, no, for sure. And what is and that's why we're doing all these different episodes as well. Like I said, you're one of our Seedstars heroes, because you dedicate your life to having an impact, and we would love the world to hear more about stories like yours, more than Narcos. So maybe we should think about an episode where we have we have you and other protagonists. I think we can have a hit on Netflix for sure. um, then you decided to leave the UN, and for some reason you decided to move into the academic world,
Right.
for a couple of years. What was the reason? Because you were very much on the ground on one side, I have the
Right.
impression,
Right.
and
Right.
suddenly you take a step back and go back to the books, I would say.
Right.
Why is
Right.
that?
There were many reasons for it, but it coincided with a period of my life when I was working very close with different stakeholders, and as we call them technically, non-state armed actors. At that time, a few episodes touched me more directly, that allowed me to take a step back and prevented me from dealing with this every day. I must say that anybody who works in conflict and hears the stories day in, day out, of children, of mothers, of family members who have been victims and who have witnessed unspeakable realities, wear out at some point, and their capacity to stay committed and to give everything they have also reaches a limit. And I think it was around the time where a very dear friend of mine got killed in my hometown that I started rethinking what I wanted to do in the next stage of working for peace in Colombia and more broadly. And that led me to think about, as I was saying before, those root causes of resource distribution, the economic power of stakeholders to bring development about, the environment, and the social interactions. And all of that coincided with the birth of the programs that ETH here in Switzerland was exploring on the topic of sustainability. So ETH sustainability was right under directorate, and they were looking for individuals who were bringing the different perspective, what should coin into that fight for sustainability early on. And I spent some time in that academia co-developing the course on sustainability. It's the YES course for Youth Encounter on Sustainability. We had participants from over 80 countries, I believe, and some 90 disciplines of study coming together every summer to shape actions and to shape concrete follow-up to this training that we could have an impact on in different parts of the world. And I believe some like 60 to 70% of the people who participated in these courses went back home and did something very practical with it, either start a movement or a startup or a small initiative that would carry this impact forward. So that's what I dedicated the next stages of my life.
Yeah, and afterwards you went into what we call venture philanthropy. How is that different from impact investment?
Yeah, well, there are at that time there was no difference. We're talking about 2007 when I first came into that concept. Today we have a plethora of terms and different overlapping concepts and definitions that can become very technical. But venture philanthropy basically is a form of philanthropy that uses principles of investing to obtain very measurable results, and uses different instruments, financial instruments, besides grants, also loans and sometimes even equity, to support organizations that are doing work in line with their mission. Impact investing, the more technical terms, separated from venture philanthropy in the return expectations, so to say. So if you are doing this with a capital preservation, you're more on the venture philanthropy side. If you're doing this also expecting to make some money on the upside, you're more into the impact investing space. And so at that time, there was no such definitions. It was a nascent field even here in Europe, and it was venture philanthropy.
And so do you believe that you can have both, so profit and purpose at the same time?
I think there is, depending on the industry you're in, there's certain trade-off. The industry leaders often claim that this is not the case, but in practice, if you're serving the least advantaged, if you're working under extreme conditions, you know it well, you're working with us in one of these less resource environments, shallower markets, with clients that are more vulnerable to shocks, and so on and so forth, it is harder to make money on those markets. If you're working on things like education, also where the state should have a critical role, and you're somewhat serving a middle income class or even a low income class, but in other words, you're somehow taking the role of the state in the provision of those services. That's very difficult to do in a purely market-based logic. If you're going up the ladder, either in terms of better developed markets, more affluent clients, or in more developed sort of industries, you will have a little bit more capacity to make money, but also the basic impact that you can create at the bottom of the pyramid also suffers a bit in that equation. I do believe that there's a certain trade-off, and the unicorns of this world where you can have an incredible amount of impact and make money on that have proved to be very few in the impact investing space.
We have this work together in Ivory Coast where we are trying to have both at the same time, profit and purpose. And it's true, we're working in the education sector together. That's extremely challenging indeed to serve some populations, especially the lowest income segment in the education sector, and trying to find a viable business model. So there are models that we are experimenting together, which are similar to what Andela, for example, is doing in Nigeria, where they train developers, and then they sell their skills. They export their skills in the US, for example, with doing the same with digital marketing, for example, together. So these are some models. It's true that but if you talk about early childhood development, for example, and trying to find ventures around that, it's extremely complicated. So I tend to agree with you. And no, that makes me think of one question that I had for you is, what is your relationship with money? Because for a lot of people, that's a sign of success. And especially for people, not especially, it's worldwide, but I would say that in emerging markets, sometimes even more, because especially if you see all these examples on TV, media, etc., that's success. If we look at all your choices, it seems that it was never influenced by that. How come?
I was actually paying to work when I started doing peace work. So I had to pay my own tickets to go to conferences or to go to the ground and do some work there. And there was no way of getting paid for that. I do believe that if one pursues one passion, at one point in time, one can find a way to get by. And that has worked very well in my career choices. My relation to money, however, is not one of indifference. I believe money is a very powerful tool one can use to align stakeholders around specific objectives. And I've always worked close to money or managing money or investments in one form or another because of that belief and because of that possibility that I see.
Okay, but it's not a motivator for you.
Personally, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, as I said before, the choices I've made have landed me in a very uh, fortunate position at this point in time. But it hasn't been the motivator to get from one stage of my career to the next.
Yeah, that's interesting and honestly very inspiring, I guess, for a lot of people. Because even if I talk to my friends, they're extremely smart. They have all the opportunities in their life, and for some reason, they still work for a paycheck and the largest possible. And that's really what motivates them. But they know that long term, it's not what will make them happy. So that's
Right.
also inspiring to hear from you. That was not. I don't know, something that you work necessarily for. Of course, you need to have a nice living, you have a family, etc.
Correct.
But I think that's quite inspiring for a lot of people.
No, what comes from the fortune of doing something that you love with smart people in a place of possibility, so that you can actually create a change, is something that is valuable to me.
Yeah, no, for sure. Um, and one of the question now would be, what's next for you and the foundation? Where are you guys heading to?
I already mentioned a little bit about our new strategy. We want to really do for learning what has been done for medical sciences in terms of the human genome and understanding really what makes up
Mm.
the individuality and the heterogeneity in that. And so that's as a topic where we're heading to. Now we're going to develop a large program on schools. On one hand, we are working now with systems and societies and public policymakers, but we also have to work from the bottom up, really at the forefront of where learning happens, and do programs with schools, with teachers, with headmasters. And at the same time, we're going to continue with our passion for evidence. So we're going to continue supporting research around learning and around development of the learning sciences. So those three things will come together. But our aspiration goes beyond what we will do as a foundation. We want to also revolutionize in many ways the work that certain industries are conducting their business, so that they can actually include education. We are very close to achieving that with the partners of the cocoa and chocolate industry, for instance. But we also want to see how other foundations can take up on more entrepreneurial ways of creating philanthropic solutions beyond the charity and the single one-off project, but really seeing what the potential is of mobilizing capital for systems change.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And I think that metaphor or comparison with the medical industry is extremely interesting. It's true that we've done tremendous advancements in that sector, and it's true that in the education sector, it seems like it hasn't moved for 100 or 200 years, and we have everything to learn. So I think that's extremely exciting to be also at this position time now, where it seems to me that we're kind of still at the beginning of trying to understand on how that works.
The education system we have in place has served us well for the last 200 years. There
Yeah.
has never been so many educated people as we have today around the world, but it won't serve us well for the next 200 years. So it's time that
Mm.
we start looking into that and bringing, as you say, the innovation and the next level of development that we will
Yeah.
need for the future.
I have now more questions that we ask to all our protagonists in this podcast. So one of them would be, um, what kind of impact do you intend to have personally?
I think there's a lot to what I personally want to achieve, which is related to everything we've discussed. How do we use incentives? How do we use instruments to create systems change? In other words, let's use capital to create alliances that otherwise wouldn't have formed and achieve results that otherwise wouldn't have come in place. So one thing that we've been working very hard on is to involve the cocoa and chocolate industry in the quality of education of the countries where they're sourcing their raw material from. And the government, the cocoa and chocolate industry, and philanthropic sector are coming together and finding ways to understand each other and create value that wouldn't otherwise have happened. So this, for me, is a source of inspiration to try and transfer that to other industries, to other contexts, and seeing what other new horizons one can build with that.
For sure. Could you refer a book or podcast or documentary that you think would be relevant, or that maybe had a big impact on you?
Well, it's interesting at this time of home office and homeschooling, which all of our young parents are seeing. One sees the capacity to work on many fronts very limited. So I'm reading Essentialism by Greg McKeown. And the way he describes what one could adopt as a disciplined pursuit of the essential or less is amazing. And I think it's incredibly powerful. I also live with an essentialist at home. So she's my first source of concentration and focus. And I'm sure you do too. So
yeah, indeed. Indeed. And what are your company values?
We have three values. One of them is accountability. So we want to be accountable for what we do. We want to be accountable for the resources that we have at our disposition and for the impact that we claim that we can create. The second one is partnership. We're very aware we cannot achieve these things. None of the big endeavors we want to get to alone, and that requires that we partner with other organizations, with governments, with other stakeholders. And the last one is my favorite one. It's called aspiration. And we want to aspire to doing things that haven't been done before. We want to be what other organizations were when they became very innovative and broke some of the models and molds that shaped society in our domain, which is learning.
Mm-hmm. What word, quote, or phrase describes you best?
Describes me best. I don't know if it describes me best, but I find myself using this quote a lot. It's from a French author, Marcel Pagnol, who said once, "Tout le monde savait que c'était impossible, jusqu'un jour, il est venu un imbécile qui ne le savait pas et qui l'a fait." Everybody knew it was impossible until an imbecile came one day who didn't know it and did it. So I want us in our organization and myself personally to be that imbecile who doesn't know enough about what is impossible and it's therefore able to think about things differently.
That's nice. There is a nice video that we can post also afterwards on the podcast of exactly that crazy person that goes and dance alone, and suddenly you have other people joining, and you need that stupid person in the beginning so that people can follow.
Exactly.
And finally, like I said, you are one of our Seedstars hero. Can you share with us who would be your hero?
That's a very difficult question. I thought about this for a while. It turns out since my early childhood, I don't have heroes, but I do have traits that I admire, and they're all very human. My mother, the tenacity of my mother is something that I want to carry for my life. The calmness and positivism of my dad, the consistency of Nati, my partner, the making the hard but right choices that she brings to my life, the resilience of my kids. These are all traits that I would somehow amalgam together. The smiles and happiness of my sisters, the comradeship and friendship of my dear friends. Those are things that I admire, that I would like to keep and put together in a sort of like multi-person hero.
Super interesting and inspiring. Thanks a lot, Fabio. I would love to discuss more on all the different topics. Your life is extremely inspiring, and of course, the topics you're working on are extremely interesting. I guess we'll need to catch up offline again in order to deep dive in all these different topics. Thank you,
Fabio, guys at Seedstars for your work. It's you who are creating these changes. It's you who are at the forefront of innovation and of entrepreneurship. It's you who we believe on, and it's you that actually enables us to achieve great things. So that's why I said you guys are an extended part of our Jacobs Foundation family, and the work that we're doing together is not only inspiring, it's worth talking about. So please go on with this series and also talk about the great things that are happening at the forefront of your work.
Thank you for listening to our hero's journey, and subscribe now for more stories on Seedstars podcast.